As you just heard, we are recording today. So I invite you, we'll have folks pinned who are speaking, so you won't be on the recording, but if you feel extra security, you can turn your camera off. We're also going to ask you to use the chat to ask any questions. So if you want to type whatever questions you have in the chat, and then indicate if you want your name, your first name said or not. But as we gather and we wait a couple of minutes for a few more folks to join us, I just invite you to practice with that chat and type where it is that you are calling from today. We'd like to know who all is with us. I'm also making assumptions at this time that we are all familiar with how to use the chat. This is great. We have folks from Las Vegas, Illinois, Cleveland, Texas, Michigan, Wisconsin, Baltimore. This is great. So what we're going to do today, we have Mike Martin with us from RAWTools, and he is going to teach us how to disarm guns, to legally disarm unwanted guns, and how to use the chop saw to do this. And we are calling for everybody to take action to disarm guns on September 4th. Our goal is to disarm 150 guns on that day. And the reason why is because the NRA will be gathering that weekend in Houston, Texas. And part of their gathering is to celebrate 150 years as an organization. So we want to make a counter witness to their weekend, to their 150 years, because we know what 150 years of the NRA has brought us. It has brought us a world where guns are everywhere, to where children are afraid to return to school because they're afraid of the return of school shootings. They're afraid to go to the movies, to go to the mall. They're afraid even in their homes. So we want to be a voice that says that we want to create the world that Isaiah envisions, where swords will be turned into plowshares. So in this case, guns will be converted into garden tools. And we as congregations, this is a role that we can play in this, that we can be what the Presbyterian Church Book of Order calls for, is that one of the great ends of the church is to be an exhibition of the kingdom of God to the world. And so this is one way we can live into that call, by creating the world that we want to see. So we hope that you'll be able to join us on September 4th to disarm any unwanted guns that you have in your community. You can do this by putting an announcement in your bulletin. But we also hope this is a ministry that will continue beyond September 4th, that this is a way that we as a church can take action and show our kids that we care. I read an article this week from a young woman in California who was a senior, going to be a senior in high school, and she said that while she is concerned about returning to school because of the coronavirus, she's more scared about gun violence, because she feels like she can do something about the coronavirus. She can get a vaccine, she can wear a mask, she can stay distance, but she said she feels helpless when it comes to gun violence. So this is a way that we can say we're not helpless, we can do something. So I'm going to turn it over now to Mike, and he's going to show us how to disarm. Thanks.
Well, thanks everyone for coming today. I'm going to share my screen here so we can kind of go through a PowerPoint together that shows all the different things that we need to know to do. So this is a picture of our National Disarming Network. Right now you can go to RAWTools.org and kind of apply, fill out a form to be a part of this. It basically tells us you're interested in being a part of the Disarming Network. All those blue dots are folks who have either space or a chop saw or both, that when a gun donor in their area reaches out to us, I can connect them to those volunteers. So even you might see some of these dots near where you live, but for instance, there's 3, I think, in Dallas, but that doesn't mean we can't have 12 in Dallas or 10, because I often have to go to 3 or 4 people before I find someone who's available in time to meet with the donor or has both the tools and the space. So we'll talk about that, but that's one way you can plug in here, and it's kind of what started this connection with Deanna and the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. So this is kind of a part of what you all are connecting with when we're doing this. It's a simple form on our website. Just fill it out, and we'll talk more here, get into pieces. Some things, safety is always number one. I think that probably goes, maybe you feel like that's assumed, but if you're not familiar with guns, we have people who are a part of our network who are not familiar with guns. There's a few things that we need to go through. You should always invite someone who is familiar with guns to be with you until you are at a place where you can do that and look at a gun and know that it's unloaded. Instruct our donors here. This is also part of an information sheet that we send out when we connect with gun donors that we can make available to you as well. But you want to instruct donors to check for this, for their gun to be unloaded before meeting you. If they're unsure how to do that, make sure that they know how to communicate that to you. So if they say that, I don't know that this is unloaded or not, I don't know how to check it, I'm not familiar with it, then at least know or tell them to let you know that. That way that you're aware that they're unfamiliar with it. When you're handling the firearm, always point it away from people, to the ground if possible, even if you've already checked that it's unloaded and you know that that's happening. There are often photos being taken at these, and you never want to create an illusion that a gun is being pointed at someone. So that's also something to keep in mind when you're doing this. And tool safety is just as important. 99%, probably higher, of the guns that you encounter will be unloaded. So even if a trigger is accidentally pulled or something is engaged that would normally fire around, that's likely not to happen. But it's always important to keep that gun pointed away. So when you're using the tool, that's when you're more likely to hurt yourself or someone else. So if you're also not familiar with using power tools that you'll see later, so that's a power saw like you would use to cut a piece of wood, a chop saw, or a grinder that's a little more handheld with a clamp. If you've never used one of those before, be sure to practice on any kind of junk metal or something like that before you work with a firearm, because you don't want that to be the first time that you're using it. All of this and connected to safety is wrapped in this process of federal law. So we have a ton of questions, and especially with gun laws changing from state to state, city to city, different counties and cities within the same state might have 3 different levels of gun laws. We disable all the firearms according to federal law, which is making 3 cuts through the receiver of a firearm. All this will have pictures too. The receiver of the firearm is essentially where it receives the bullet prior to it being fired. So we want to make 3 cuts through that. That receiver is what federal law labels as the firearm itself. So that means the butt of the rifle, the barrel of the gun, the trigger, the sight, all of that is accessory to the receiver. That if the receiver is cut up, there's no way a firearm can be used. If you cut the barrel short, you can still use it. If you even pull the trigger out, there's ways to activate it. If you take the butt off the back, the support, you can still fire it. So The receiver is where everything kind of is the technical firearm and everything happens. The way for us to get here in Colorado, especially, there's a requirement for a background check if I make a person-to-person transfer of a firearm, not just from a licensed dealer. Federal law says licensed dealers have to have a background check for everyone who's buying or selling a gun to them. So in states that don't require a background check from person to person, there's a lot less red tape for you, but our process gets through all of that red tape, whether or not a background check is needed. And we do that by disabling the firearm while the donor is present. So they should not leave. They're not just dropping off a gun with you and then leaving for you to cut it up. You should never be in possession of a working firearm. Especially if you're representing RAWTools, if you get a gun donor who wants to drop it off and leave, tell them it's not possible. If they want to do that, they can take it to a law enforcement agency. But if they want the gun to be disabled and used in our network to be made into garden tools and art, they have to stay. It's usually 5 to 10 minutes, sometimes even shorter than that, depending on the firearm that they're bringing. But they have to stay with you. That way, when they leave, what's left is not a firearm. So no transfer has taken place and you're not in possession of a working firearm. You're in possession of parts. So I think there's a few people who have maybe, oh, no, just some comments. Good. If anyone has questions, feel free to put that in the chat. We'll also have time for questions at the end. So this is a setup that one of our volunteers used in near Jacksonville, Florida. He has a sawhorse here. This is a picture right on the firearm with this clamp. These grips on firearms usually have a screw, basically right where under this clamp here. It won't hurt to take a set of screwdrivers with you because sometimes these are really round and hard to secure. So you could quickly unscrew the screwdriver, or the screw, and get that grip off of there to better clamp it. But this is pretty safe. And then he's using this hand grinder. So it's got a support coming out the side like this. I can also provide links for specific tools if you need that. And then it's got back here with this hand is where the power button is. But essentially that's a really good support to have. They don't always come with this extra support on the side. And he's making a cut on these revolvers. The other thing to keep in mind with these different types of guns will react differently to these different saws. So some will be easy to clamp, some won't be easy to clamp. When you're using a saw that we'll have a picture of later in these videos, they come with a clamp that you can put everything in there, and that works really well for rifles. These handguns, like this round cartridge that holds the bullets there, can be hard to clamp in the bigger table saw that you would use, or the bench saw that you might use to cut it up. So it's easier to use this hand grinder. You can still use a bigger saw. You just have to make sure that you're safe, because you get closer and closer to that blade. Something to keep in mind is that there's a lot of laws that regulate the length of barrels, especially on rifles and shotguns. And when you get below 17 inches, I believe, for shotguns and rifles, it becomes an illegal firearm. So when you make your first cut, we can illustrate that here. You don't want it to be the cut that's closest to the barrel, because if I just cut right here, theoretically you could still fire the firearm, whether this was a pistol or if it was a rifle that had a longer barrel. You don't want to make like a sawed off illegal firearm, even though it's only going to be illegal for about 10 to 20 seconds until you make the next cut. It's best to move from the handle of the firearm toward the barrel with your cuts. Essentially, your first cut usually kind of takes out all the moving pieces between the trigger and this hammer here. Some handguns now have slides. That's probably what you're familiar with seeing in movies. That once we disconnect all the moving parts between the trigger and the slide of the hammer, then it's even safer for you to start cutting up the rest of the firearm, and you're not breaking any laws that every now and then you get someone who's standing by, especially if you're at a public event, who wants to nitpick at those things.
Hey, Mike, question
Yes.
on that. Can you point out where is the receiver on that gun?
So the receiver is this cartridge here where all the bullets kind of sit in there, 5 or 6, 4 to 6 usually, like a revolver. You'll see this on a Western. This spins after each trigger is pulled. It lines up the next one. It receives the bullets and seats them ready to fire, basically. On this next one, the receiver, let me pull it open here. This is the barrel of the firearm, and these firearms usually have the magazines of bullets in the grip, and so the receiver is right here above the grip of the firearm. So we're cutting these smaller handguns. You cut 3 guns, it looks like you're just cutting it into a whole bunch of pieces, not just the receiver. The bigger guns that you get, you're just cutting the receiver like a rifle or shotgun. So this is actually the barrel of the gun that's, the slide is moving back. So when you pull the trigger, instead of that hammer on the revolver slapping against the back of the bullet, essentially, this slide is the hammer that is being pulled back. And as it's pulled back, it discharges the empty casing from the bullet, and a new bullet is put up in its place, and it slides back into form. So this gun barrel is really only about 3 to 4 inches long on this particular firearm, and the receiver is right behind it. So the receiver might even be part into the handle a little bit, but it's really this area where the bullet is seated into the barrel prior to the next pull of the trigger.
Thank you.
And I'll show you, there's going to be a diagram that has the 6 or 7 most common firearms that you'll encounter that will specifically show the receivers on all of those. One thing to note, especially since we're people of faith in this group, that trauma can come with gun donations. So it's not, it's always encouraged that if you're aware of that, if you get a donation that comes through our website and you're a part of our Disarming network, we have a box on there that people can check to let us know if trauma is a part of their circumstances for donating the firearm. Either it's they've lost a loved one recently and these guns have been inherited by them, or they've lost a loved one through suicide. That's where you're going to get the most occurrences of trauma. So it doesn't hurt to have a pastoral or counseling presence there, especially if they ask you for that, then please provide it. Even if it's just to have someone there who they may not speak about their what happened to them, but for them to know that that's a possibility is really, really helpful and comforting to a lot of gun donors. I've had it where people bring the firearm straight out of the evidence box because they just picked it up at the police station after any kind of investigation that might have happened into the suicide. You're not going to get a gun given to you that was used in a homicide. I've never encountered that unless you're working with confiscated firearms from police, and even that, most of those firearms were not used in a crime. The person just committed a felony and no longer is allowed to own firearms, and that's why they had to give them up and get them confiscated. But to be aware of that trauma of gun violence, that it could be 20 years old or it could be months. So we've had people just a couple weeks removed from the trauma of suicide, and I've had an instance where they had a pretty severe reaction when they saw the firearm that a friend was bringing to. They knew the friend had it, but once they physically saw it, that there was a reaction that everybody needed to pause, and we needed to make space for them to deal with the emotions that they were experiencing. So just be aware of that. And usually it's not something that's going to surprise you at the event. It's something that you can learn about as you're asking questions before you're meeting with that person. And if you have questions about how to navigate that space, you can ask them, but also feel free to email me or connect with us if that's an issue. So I wanted to show some videos here of actually cutting up the firearms. And part of this slide firearm is one of the most common handguns that you're going to get donated to you. And this little piece or catch here slides up just barely into this notch in the slide. And when you open this up and see it from the other side, you can look into the barrel to see if it's unloaded. So when I flip it over here, I hope to show it to you well enough. Well, I didn't. There. Oh. Sorry. This little slide piece right here, when you pull the slide back, this part opens up and you can see right into the barrel to see if there's a bullet there or not. I want to go back to the first one to watch me cut it up. So this is an example of how a hand can give you issues on this bigger saw. It has this clamp right here that you can tighten the firearm right up against it, and then you bring the saw blade down to cut it, and we're going to watch it here. I don't know if I can show if my audio is shared or not. You don't really need it, but if you do have your audio up higher, this will be loud if you're hearing it. So I'm clamping it in there. This piece, that's where the magazine goes up into the firearm. But the motor on the saw is on the other side. And sometimes as you bring the saw down, it can stop on the top of that handle. So you might have to flip the gun over to get it all the way cut through. In this case, this saw blade is fairly worn. So I'm actually not going to be able to get all the way down through on this cut, and I'll be flipping it over to finish the cut. But one of the safety things you need to, it has this guard here, but you need to be aware of where your sparks are going to fly, especially if you have a group. The best place for people to be is behind you, and no one to be in front of you, or any kind of like dry leaves or something like that that might be in your area, depending on the time of year. Always be aware of fire. Sometimes I even bring a fire extinguisher. That's not necessary, but you can see I got most of the way through the cut here, and I started back at the trigger. And by the way, the gun donor is standing behind me watching. He's donating 5 firearms. This happened a couple weeks ago. Just shows you kind of the time it takes. This is one cut. There'll be 2 more cuts that are going to be made on this firearm. It's helpful. I'm using a pair of pliers there because it gets really hot. So you can wear gloves to help you with that. There you can see, this is where you can look into the barrel to see if the bullet was in there.
So Mike, as we're watching the cuts, there was another question that asked if will there be any parts of the gun that could be used as parts for other guns after we make our cuts?
No, unless it depends. It depends on how many accessories came with it. So we have like sights, things like that. If they've given you clips or magazines without bullets, don't ever accept ammunition. Tell them that they can give ammunition to local law enforcement. Either your police or your sheriff should be comfortable with doing that. Sometimes they won't. In that case, maybe you know a responsible gun owner who is using it safely that would be happy to have the ammunition. But other than that, always take ammunition to your local police department. So I'm really close to the end of that cut, so I was able to just break it apart. But most of the pieces that we're cutting through you're putting almost all the moving pieces into 2 pieces. So one, if someone is knowingly taking a part that they thought was from a disabled firearm, it's probably bent or broken in such a way that it's not safe for them to reuse. but every now and then there are accessories, like we had a couple firearms with a bayonet, for instance, or sometimes people donate knives to us, in which case we just blunt the edge of it and make sure it can't harm anyone. If you have any question if it's going to be could be used in the future, just make another cut. There's no harm in making more cuts than what the diagram shows. It's always okay to be able to do that. Now on the video right now, you're seeing it's getting harder and harder to clamp because I'm running out of clamp space on this firearm to clamp it. And so this is why you can do everything with this saw, but you need to be really safe when you do it. And I might even have to use an extra clamp or a different tool to finish the cut on some of these guns. This is a shotgun, and it's an older shotgun. When I get to the diagram of where everything's being cut, it'll make some sense too. But these older shotguns, this part here is almost entirely steel. All the moving parts fold together. Some new firearms are, the only steel part is the barrel, like the gun that I just cut the firearm before. The barrel in that firearm is only about 5 inches, if we're lucky, long. And the rest of it is plastic, aluminum, brass, and other soft metals. So it's fairly simple to cut through. We're not going to watch all this video, but I don't know how much you can see, but it's about 10 minutes long. And that's how long it took me to cut up the gun. One, because there was a lot of resistance because it was essentially like a thick bar of steel, but also because it was tripping my breaker. So that's something that you might run into. If you're set up at a commercial building like a church, most of their electricity will be able to support this. I'm set up in a residential garage in this video. And so sometimes the breakers, depending on the electricity there, can't handle the power that's being asked by the saw from that breaker. So I was fortunate that I could just take a step and flip the breaker back on, but I had to cut through it or flip that breaker about 10 times. Right there, it just broke and I had to go. And you can see I only got, a 1/4 of an inch. So 5 minutes in, I'm only halfway down, but this is almost entirely all steel. So this is one of those 3 cuts to make. This shows you what it looks like afterwards so that you can see how it was almost all steel. Right in front of this, you can see the barrel there. Viewed from the other side was the receiver for the shotgun shells. So we'll show you that on a picture later. This is just making another cut through it. It goes a little faster than before because there's not as much back there, but it's just another example. So this is a similar slide. So if you pulled as the one that I cut up before, when you pull this slide back this way, this is the barrel. It basically stays where it's at. But when you pull that slide back, you'll see right into the barrel to see if there's a bullet there. You'll also be able to look into the handle if any magazines are there. Most gun owners are familiar with these firearms and will bring this to you without a magazine in it. If they bring it to you with a magazine in it, ask them to remove the magazine unless you are very familiar to do that yourself. But you can easily pull back this slide. Some of them are fairly difficult to pull back because there's a heavy spring that keeps them shut and helps them function. But pull it back and you can look right into here. You'll see that the back end or the bottom side of a bullet, it'll be a brass 1/4 inch ring that you can see if there's a bullet in there or not. If there is, ask the donor to remove it if you're not comfortable doing it yourself. Essentially, the rule of thumb is if you're not comfortable, don't do it until you learn to get comfortable to do that. So I'm using a grinder. Oh, it doesn't want me to, it's not letting me play it. We'll show this firearm that you can see, well, it'll be easier for it to cut. It has a wheel that's about 4 to 5 inches. I'm cutting off the cartridge, before I cut through the rest of it. Sometimes they can get in the way of all the different cuts that you make. I recommend that you would wear pants when you're doing this. I know I'm wearing shorts. I'm just a little bit more familiar with the sparks at this point. So I cut revolvers a little bit more than what the diagram will show you, that I'll give you here in a second. But I'm also going to pull up that other video if I can. But it goes a lot faster when you have a lot more control of the blade like this, especially for handguns. So these can also do the larger firearms too. You just need to make sure you have a clamp like the sawhorse that I showed you before, or a secure place like the tailgate of a pickup truck with like a C-clamp that can fasten it to the tailgate of the pickup, or some sort of table that you brought with you, or even a bike rack at the church or something like that. Wherever you're at, you need to make sure that that gun is safely in there. So I made actually 2 cuts that kind of separates the different working mechanisms around the hammer to the trigger. So this is the second one. The first one was that way. But you can see that sparks are a major part of this. So just be aware of what you're around when you're doing this. So these are pictures of the firearms that I cut up. So you can kind of see the makings of this revolver, how it was cut in different places. Another revolver here. That handgun that the video I didn't get to share, I'm going to go pull up the file. This one ended up being cut into about 12 different pieces. Sometimes when you cut it, what you'll see in that video when I bring it up, and I'll just go to it at the end, that parts move sometimes while you're cutting it. So even when you're at the larger yellow saw, you can cut through something, and then when you pick up the saw blade, a spring might kind of fall out or be I'm going to say launched, but it's not like flying at great speeds, but it can be a surprise. It's not going to hurt anybody. It's not flying that fast enough, but you're cutting through moving parts that have tension behind them. So sometimes that can happen while you're cutting, or after you've made a cut and you pull the blade out of its space. So just be aware that those things can happen. So let me go get a couple extra things for you to see here. Did that diagram come up? Are you seeing that? Do I need to share it? I think I need to. There we go.
Yeah, no, we're not seeing it.
Okay, is that helpful?
Yes.
So this firearm is a lot like that slide firearm that we were seeing here. These are where you make the 3 cuts. Whether the slide is open or shut, you can make these cuts there. It's basically making it useless, right? This is making sure this main cut right here, this cut I actually make a little bit closer. Sometimes people can stress over getting these angles exactly right. It's okay if it's going right through here and kind of this way, up and down. The clamp on the big gun can be turned, or on the big saw can be turned at different angles to help you get this. If you're using a hand grinder, like at that clamp at the last one, it's really easy to get all these angles. Any slight angle is helpful, a little bit better than a straight cut. In theory, straight cuts are easier to repair than an angled cut. Although many of the gun owners who vehemently dislike what I'm doing openly admit they would never want to fire a gun that we've cut up in these 3 places. It's just not safe. And firearms are so inexpensive, it's easier to just buy a new one than to pay someone to repair it after we've made these 3 cuts. So these are the most common firearms that you're going to get. We'll go through each one. This is the handgun with the slide. So a 9mm or something similar to that. Different calibers can be there, but that will probably be one of your more popular ones, or a 45. Same with these revolvers. These are just harder to clamp. Sometimes you can unscrew these grips to help make it easier to secure. But these are all where you're making those cuts to make sure that they don't work anymore. Some of these are just pictures of receivers. They don't have the rest of your gun. So this is a bolt action receiver. and this is most common in hunting rifles or 22s, things like that, where this is the bolt, you pull it back, and this is where you would see the bullet on the other side of this. This is the trigger that's sticking out right here. So you would usually have like a rifle butt right behind this. If you have any of these questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'm also available often for folks who are cutting up pieces. If you're going to be doing this on September 4th, there's going to be a good portion of that day where I would be available to video in. If you're having questions with this, that's very okay to do. But this piece here on this bolt action firearm pulls back, and usually when you see the firearm itself, it will be pulled back so that they can show you that it's unloaded. But this is where the bullet would sit, and the barrel of the gun is out here. Everything outside of this is really accessory to the firearm. So you have, you might have a magazine that would go in under here, and then the barrel's going out this way, and then the support or back of the rifle is over here. This one here is a shotgun. This is the window into seeing where this actually isn't the barrel under here. The barrel would be right above it. This might be a loader where other shells or cartridges are then put up into the receiver. But this piece here is the receiver of the firearm, and you're making these cuts. They want them to be opposite. The main idea is that you're cutting through these parts of the section. So the support, the butt of the firearm is back this way, the barrel goes up forward, and this is where you can see if there's a shotgun shell in there or not. This is a more standard single shot rifle right here, where you've got, you might even be placing the bullet in up there. It's very rare to get some of these, but you're just making those 3 cuts, one between that trigger and the hammer, one in front of that, and another one up there, kind of on the other side of where the bullet would be sitting before it's shot. These 3 down here are all assault style weapons. This is an AR-15 receiver. So your trigger is right in here. This is where you would see a magazine. This is where the bullet pops up, and the barrel is threaded right here. So the barrel of the gun is actually going this way. Your trigger housing is right here, and this is where the bullets come up and go through. So if you see a picture of an AR-15, or when someone brings it to you, or an M16, that's what AR-15, M16s, those follow this kind of model, and everything outside of this is accessory to it. So when people talk about why it's hard to regulate assault style firearms, this is why. It's because you can build so many different things off of this receiver. So this looks like the most complicated one. If you don't feel comfortable or can't quite get these angles, just make extra cuts. You can cut it into 10 pieces if that makes you feel better. But as long as this is sufficiently destroyed with at least 3 cuts through these sections, then it can't be put back together. So it's making a cut here between the trigger and the barrel, and this cut here is between the trigger and the hammer mechanism, essentially, for it, between the receiver and the barrel. So, and then this cut makes it hard for the magazine to be inserted and fastened inside there. This SKS here is a Russian firearm. It's a assault style. It's kind of, when you see it, it might seem like a mix between a bolt action and this AR-15. You're cutting those 3 different legs. I've only seen 2 of these, and they were from the same gun donor in the last almost 9 years. This one down here, the last one, is an AK-47. It's a little easier to see how things would set up behind it. You've got your wood stock back here, probably some sort of wood piece or steel above the receiver, and you're making 3 cuts right here. This is where that kind of famous crooked magazine would be coming out, where the bullet goes up. So you're cutting up right where the bullets would seat into the barrel, as well as the moving parts between the trigger and the hammer mechanisms. I see some things in the chat for questions.
Yeah, so we have possible to use carpentry compound miter saw fitted with blade to cut metal. Is it
That is
possible?
that's a good question. Theoretically, it's possible, but I really don't advise it. The saws, the motors that are designed to cut wood do not have the torque nor the power to cut through metal. So you can put a metal blade on it and you can make a cut, but you might ruin the motor. If you're going slow enough with very little force, you can do it, but it's going to take you a lot longer time. It could take a half an hour to do what you could in 5 to 10 minutes. So um, at the at trying to take care of the tools that you have, I would not use a metal blade in a wood saw. That's a good question.
Are there any other questions? We had one about if police are necessary, and I gave an answer that it depends. If you're just meeting with an individual donor, you've had prior contact, that it's not generally necessary. And then also if there's a gun buyback, might be a different situation, and then that all again even then depends on your police and what they require to be present and what your goals are. But named that, we're not necessarily talking about buybacks today. We can help with that at a later time, but I'm wondering if you have any other comments you want to say, Mike, about police.
Some police, whether it's a buyback or because essentially this person that these videos are from, can you see the new one that I just put up?
Yes.
These firearms, he donated 5. So buybacks are essentially this on a scale. So you could get have a buyback and only have 5 donors that bring 1 gun each. And that's in some areas a very successful buyback. So you don't need police presence so long as the donor is staying there while you disable the firearm. Typically, police can handle gun donations or people just getting rid of guns. If I'll tell people to take it to their law enforcement if I can't coordinate someone to help them disable it, because they act very similar to an FFL, which is a federally licensed gun dealer. They have the authority to receive those firearms. Essentially, you don't need to run a background check on law enforcement if you're giving them the firearm. So, but when you're doing these person-to-person meetups, if you feel like you need security for that, I would say that you probably shouldn't be meeting the donor in the first place. If you get uncomfortable with that, you should tell them to give it to the police. For instance, we had one gun donor who wanted to give firearms to us that we weren't so sure about, and the flag was in his email, was highlighting a type of gun. So the email that he had us correspond with had Glock in it, which is a really popular handgun. A lot of law enforcement use it, but it turned out that his dad was a gunsmith and he inherited a lot of either not working firearms or firearms that he didn't want. And he heard about us, and so he had us come there. But there's little things that might make you feel uncomfortable, and I think you should trust your instincts on that. And if you don't feel comfortable doing it, if it's going through us, let me know and I can pry more. If it's something that you're doing through your local church, you could say, let's either I'll have law enforcement there with me, or I just advise you to give it to law enforcement. But there's no law being broken by you not having law enforcement there, so long as the donor is staying there until the gun is disabled. I'm going to play this video up. Go ahead.
There's another question. Is there any concern about getting serial numbers or info off the gun in case they were previously used in a crime?
So there's no legal requirement for that unless you know that your city has a registration for handguns. Some cities have this, but not many do. And I do take serial numbers. That's part of filling out the form through our website. You can always take in the serial numbers. I don't report it to law enforcement on these kind of meetups with individuals for gun donors. I do at buybacks. Mostly though, it's not to see if they've been used in a crime, because usually you can only find that out if they've been tested in a ballistic test, that they can match the ballistics of the crime scene. So because we've disabled the firearm, you're not really going to be able to match it unless there's some other forensic evidence that can do that, like a fingerprint or something. But you're not legally required to do that for it. We do it in case the firearm was reported stolen and we report that to law enforcement, they might have that serial number on file and they can notify the previous owner that their gun was found, but it's been destroyed, which is a 100% better option than police calling them to wonder how this person got a hold of their firearm when it was used in a crime. So there's no legal obligation to report serial numbers, but it is a best practice. And if you want, when you disable a firearm, you can send the serial number to me and I'm happy to do that reporting for you. But when you do these one-on-one meetups, we don't report the serial number unless you know of, I think New York City is one of them, you have to register a handgun to get a permit to carry the handgun. So that might be a case where you're legally required to, but more than anything, it's usually on the owner of that firearm to notify authorities that it's been destroyed. So it could be, they could report it as well. Sometimes you'll get gun donors who are having their firearms destroyed and they'll report it without you even bringing it up. They'll voluntarily do that just as a responsible gun owner.
And one more question about the serial numbers. Is there a particular place on the gun where those are located?
It's going to be random. It's not always at the same spot. It's usually somewhere on the barrel, or it could be around the trigger, but it's not going to be like at the end of the barrel, but it's usually going to be somewhere on that receiver because that is the technical firearm. You find that serial number, but sometimes it's really hidden. At the buyback that we did in Boulder, Colorado a couple months ago, we had the first 3 guns that were donated. Two of them were really old. It was her husband had passed away and she was in her late 80s and was not comfortable having them or handling them. So the serial numbers were just worn off. You could barely see one number, and that's okay. You just say serial numbers worn off. It's a whole nother thing when you see it and it's scratched off. That might be a signal to say, stop, you can just turn this into the police because it's been scratched off. That usually indicates it's been stolen. And who's donating it might not be a trustworthy person. But part of the form that we use on our website, which you're happy to direct people to start this process as part of our Disarming network, asks for the serial number. So usually they're reporting it when they fill it in.
All right. Thanks, Mike. We probably have time for maybe one more question. Does anybody have one more question? We really appreciate you taking the time and showing us how to do this. We know that, this is a lot of information, so that's why we have it recorded. We wonder, how do you feel after hearing all this? Does this make you want to get to do this? Do we have a yes? We're going to do this, and maybe you can tell us if you're going to be able to do this on September 4th, or are you going to be able to do this at a later time? We will be providing an email, a follow-up email that will give the link to where you can get this recording, as well as the diagrams that Mike showed us, so that you can show that.
I'm seeing some questions in the chat. If you're experienced with chop saws, is this a difficult task? No, it's not. If you've used a chop saw to cut wood, it's certainly not near as soft as that. If you have a metal chop saw and you cut through metal, it's very much the same. In fact, it might be easier than cutting through the solid metal that you might be used to, depending on how you're using it. So it's a really simple task, and it usually takes, maybe Deanna, you can speak to this too. Once you've done it, you understand kind of what kind of I guess muscle memory you use, and what all it takes the next time you do it.
I will say what I have found to be the most difficult is the handguns. And just because it takes me a long time to kind of get them on the saw and in the right place. I will also say that learn your saw. I did not, and I think when I did it the second time, my saw was not my blade was not locked down. So, but all that to say, I still did it, right? Like I still was able to really, not knowing anything, I have disarmed so far eight guns. And the other thing I will add is that when I did the next round, there was 7 that I did, and I blew the power at the church 3 times. So just know how to reset your power if something were to happen. They ended up plugging it in directly to a surge protector that they had, and all was fine. But it had to do with, again, I just kind of played with it. And after a while, I realized I was trying to force. And then if I slowed down and kind of did just a little bit and then back up and a little bit and back up, because I think my saw was starting to overheat, and it worked, and we got through them. So, play with it, figure it out. It's you can do it. If, like I said, I know nothing, and I was able to do this based upon the diagrams that Mike gave. And that's kind of how I've approached it, is I just keep cutting and just end up with a bunch of parts. So that's kind of, I guess, the last question I have is, and then we'll turn it over to Lucy, is just once you've chopped up these guns, if you're doing several, do the churches turn them into you? Does the individual turn them into you? And how do we get them to you?
So you can send it to our PO box once they've all been cut up. Sometimes you might even need to make an extra cut on like a long barrel to make it fit in a smaller box, because if you get a really long and skinny box, it's more expensive to ship. So you can cut them into 1-foot sections if you need to. But our PO box, which is on our website at rawtools.org under our contact us info, but it's also, especially if you're getting contacted by us through our online form, it's part of the process when I connect you to the donor. It's usually the gun donor that's mailing it to us, especially if they want a garden tool made from one of the guns in return. That's one of the things we offer for free, is a free tool to gun donors after we've cut it up. So essentially they pay to mail it to us, and we pay to mail the tool back to them. Usually it's about $10, maybe 20, depending on how heavy and how many firearms are being disabled, to have it mailed to us. If it's ever an issue for cost for someone to ship it to us, we are happy to reimburse that. Just let us know what that is. But it's hard to set up an account and just put it out there for people to use without it getting abused and used for a lot of things. So we're happy to reimburse shipping costs if needed. Sometimes you might be near a blacksmith in our network, and we'll just have you ship it to them. So if that happens, or you're being very active in, if you're being very active, like as a church, and saying you're a safe surrender site, we'll try and connect you to whoever the blacksmith is that's closest to you in our network, and you can supply them with the firearm parts for them to make more tools.
Great, thank you. And Lucy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks. Hey, everyone. My name is Lucy, and I am the manager of communications and digital organizing with PPF. And so one of the things that we've done to help support you in hosting a disarming event in your own congregation is to put together a digital toolkit that can help you get the word out that you are hosting an event in a variety of ways, and also just has a few pieces for further reading and amplifying why this kind of work is important, right? If you are working to educate your own congregation or community about why you're interested in disarming. So let me just share my screen with you really quickly. And here, let me first. The link is in the chat for this document. It's a Google document that we will also send out with a follow-up email. And I'll walk you through on my screen too. So what you'll see when you click on that link is just a basic Google Doc and has a little bit of introduction to the September 4th event. And you can find some basic things like the event webpage and some contact information for us and some hashtags that we'll be using for that event that we invite you to amplify and share if you do anything on social media. I just want to give a nod to the Community United Church of Christ of Boulder, Colorado, who hosted an event in conjunction with RAWTools and put together this awesome graphic and is allowing us to use that and amplify that as we sort of build more national capacity for folks to engage in this work. So there's a few different options. You know, one of the things obviously that you need to do is to invite folks who have unwanted firearms to bring them, and you have to let folks know what you're going to be doing. And so however you do that in your local context, hopefully there are some tools here that will support you. At the top, you'll see there's some bulletin inserts. So if you want to just start hyper local and kind of only put the word out in your immediate congregation and not do stuff on website or social media, that's fine. There are some bulletin inserts here that you can use. So you just click on these links and there's a version with color printing and a version with black and white in both Word and PDF. So however your church printer copy machine likes to work. I know that sometimes they can be temperamental. Hopefully one of those options will work for you. So there's some bulletin inserts there. If you just click on the links, it'll take you to a downloadable either Word or PDF document. There are several graphics that you can share on your website, social media. And again, if you just click the link above the graphic, that will take you to a Google document that will allow you to download the image. And then you can share it on whatever platforms that you'd like. And then below that are just some sample texts that you can put or invite whoever handles social media at your church to include with some of those images. And obviously you need to sort of tailor them to your particular location and make sure that you include your the name of your church and the location and time of the event so people know how to find you. So there are some sample posts here for Facebook and Instagram and Twitter as well. And then at the very bottom, there is just a list of some resources. I know some of you need to take this to boards or folks who need to sort of make a collective decision about whether or not to host. And so this is just sort of a small list of things that can help you educate your community about why you think this is important. And it's free to share as well on social media if you want to sort of educate the larger community that you live in about why your church is hosting such an event. These are all obviously public articles and things that you can share in that way as well. And then the last thing that I want to just offer, and happy to take any questions, is on the day of the event, we really encourage you to help us and help your congregation remember to tell the story about why you're doing what you're doing, and also gather in what's happened that day so that we can build on that momentum in time to come. So depending on how many of you are organizing, if you can, and you have a sort of spare volunteer, or at least someone who's kind of paying attention to this part day of, ideally you have someone who's ensuring that they're kind of being attentive to the story of how your day and your event is unfolding, and that their job is specifically to take pictures or video, to record some quotes or stories or reflections, and to just sort of gather in that content so that you and all of us collectively can tell the story about the work that we're doing. If you do take pictures and video, it's really important to do so with consent. And obviously if we're sharing a story, that we do that either with consent or no name attached. So just be mindful of that whomever is sort of in that role is someone who's able and willing to respect those boundaries and to ensure that they have consent before taking pictures. And then lastly, what we would love is, for you to just gather yourselves at the end of the day and do a little debrief together. These are some prompts you might use. What did we learn today? How did we feel the Holy Spirit was present? How did we experience hope? What feels possible after today? and to just take note of that at the end of the event, because we're going to invite you to come back together after you each have had an opportunity to do this in your own spaces. And so if you want to mark the calendar today, we have a debrief call scheduled for September 16th at 12:30 Eastern time, 9:30 Pacific, where we would love to gather you all back and just share some stories about how it went and what you've learned. And then think through collectively, how can we tell the story of this work, and what happened across the nation and congregations at the same time that the NRA was meeting. So save the date for September 16th at 12:30. I know it's always a big ask to say, hey, can someone do communications for the day? So it may be that it's not their only role, but if you just sort of have someone like tuned in to that part of it, making sure they're sort of holding that piece a little bit as you go, so we can make the work bigger than one day. Are there any questions about this? Or Deanna, do you have anything you want to offer?
Yeah, there was one question just about if they didn't do it on September 4th to the graphics are set up correct, like you've got it to where they can put their own date in, is that correct?
I don't have it set up no, to where it's editable. If they want to send me a date, it's easy enough to change it. And or I could send a graphic that does not have the date printed on it and just has the Guns to Gardens thing, and then you publish alongside that, the date. The bulletin insert, the Word document of the bulletin insert is editable, but the graphics are not.
Great, thank you. And then the other thing I'll just add is be sure to tell us your count. We want to know how many guns that you've disarmed. We're gonna keep a count. We have a place on a website to where we can see, what are us Presbyterians, how many guns are through the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, how many are we disarming, so that we can go and look at that number and find encouragement. So I think that's it. Like, so we'll get an email out next week with some follow-up information that will have all the links that we've talked about today, all the information that we've talked about. We'll give a link to the recording of this video. So you should have all that you need.
I saw one final question real quick. Someone asked how to ship it. Use a box. Any box will fit. You can even use if it fits, it ships from the U.S. Postal Service to do it. Just make sure that you use proper kind of packing, because I have had boxes show up with like a gun barrel sticking out of it. I'm surprised it actually got to me, but just make sure that, like, if you have some sharp edges, to put some newspaper around it or something like that, because I don't want gun barrels sticking out of the boxes when I pick them up, if at all possible. And we just don't want to lose the parts either.
Great, thank you. We will have this video available for sure by next week. It may be available as early as tomorrow, but we'll send the link next week. Early next week, we'll get it to you. All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, everyone. This is great. And some of you familiar faces, good to see you again.
Bye-bye.